conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
And welcome everybody to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Hopefully you're having a wonderful and amazing first of the year, it's the second day of the year, but hopefully you're having an amazing beginning of the year, kicking off everything on the absolute correct foot. I know I'm very excited for this year. A lot of big things in the works for the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Hopefully be sharing some things with you in the coming weeks and months of the kind of amazing growth that we're seeing here. But before I dig into all the stories, as always, please make sure you're sharing this out with others. And you can reach out to the show by emailing info@theandrewshow.com. Today, we got a few awesome things to cover. I know we'll be talking, of course, there's a little more going on with that driver's license thing. Maybe some of you have heard, of course, that here soon, the driver's license registration is going to be shutting down for a few weeks. There's a little more going on there than what the surface stories will tell you that raises up some concerns that you may, a prudent citizen that's paying attention may have about what's going on with this transfer process and what it could mean for the future. Now, but before that, we're coming up on the filing deadline for office for Kentucky. Typically, this is the first of the year kind of thing. We've already crossed over the filing deadlines when it came to filing to change your party's status. In Kentucky, we do a closed, primary. So you have to change your registration before the end of this year in order to go ahead and file to vote in the primary. But to file and run for office, actually, that deadline isn't until this Friday, the 5th. And that's when the deadline is. And there's a few races to watch in our state legislature that I want to draw your attention to when it comes to this final days. Now, there's a difference between I'm going to be looking at KREF filings versus official filings because, as I stated, there's still 5 days or so left in order to 4 days, whatever, the 5th. So 3 days. It's way off from the beginning to file for office. So I'm going to be looking at something called the KREF filings. This is Kentucky election finance group, and any single person that runs for office, if you want to raise money, you have to file a letter of intent with them. And before you can file to officially run, you do have to file with KREF first. So some of these people will be filed on KREF, but not filed to officially run. But here's some races to watch to draw your attention to. We're first going to look at, of course, the Senate. And there's 3 races with open seats that will be interesting to look to see who files for. And today I'm going to be focusing on the open seats. After we cross over the filing deadline and we get a look at some of the primary fields and some of the more interesting races to draw your attention to, we'll be going over that. But today we're just going to be talking about the open seats, who's filed for them, and what to look out for. So first, and this is one we've talked about a little bit here on the show, Damon Thayer, Senate District 17th. That's it's an interesting district. So it stretches from like Keeneland and Lexington, and it gets some of Masterson Station, even kind of the north side of Lexington there. And then it goes up into Scott County, and then it continues following 75 north all the way up into northern Kentucky. And so it's stretched in an interesting way. And this district is shaped in such a way that it makes it a very, very difficult district to run in. Why is that? Well, whenever you're looking at districts, Senate districts especially, you're looking at about probably around 10 to 15,000 people vote in that primary. On the high side, 15. On the low side, you might see as low as 7 or 8. But normal, I would expect around 10 to 12,000 to vote in this primary. And what's difficult about that 17th district is it's a mix of both rural and city areas. So when you're in a very heavily dense populated area, that's where door knocking can really play a big role. And that isn't always down to money. Door knockers actually cost a significant amount of money. I mean, when I was running for the state Senate, I had volunteers knocking. I was knocking. I had a few paid knockers, but the person I was running against didn't really have the incumbent there. He didn't have a whole lot of volunteers or people to help out. And so they ended up having to fly in door knockers from out of state. That gets very expensive. You're paying them, all in cost around 30 to 40 an hour. Really expensive to hit doors. So if you've got those volunteers to hit the doors for you and you're able to get out and do it, that's great. But if you're in a very urban district, you can hit most of the doors, if not all of them. But the 17th district, how it's got some urban areas, Louisville and Scott County and some parts of northern Kentucky there. It's also got a whole lot of rural areas that are very hard to knock. You can still knock them, but you got to drive from house to house. It heavily slows you down. When you're out in an urban district, you can hit 100, 150 doors a day, no problem. But in rural areas, you might get lowered all the way down to 50 on the high side. That makes it really hard to run. The other thing, too, about this 17th Senate District is that's across 2 media markets. So you have this central Kentucky media market, local news there, but then you also have the northern Kentucky media market. And, that Cincinnati media market is very expensive because, of course, while you may be running for the 17th District and while maybe a very small sliver of the listening area of Cincinnati area may actually be able to vote in your primary, they got to be Republican and live in the district. You're advertising to people up in Ohio, even, and of course, because you're covering a lot of people who don't run political ads. Well, they pay premium for those ads, and so you had to pay a premium in order to buy those spots. So it makes it difficult because you'll run ads out of the Lexington market, but then you gotta, if you've got a lot of money, you can run it there in the northern Kentucky market. So the chosen person by the establishment, whoever they flow a lot of money into, hundreds of thousands of dollars would be needed to really financially dominate this race in such a way. They'll be focused on an uphill battle there monetarily. But so far, currently, we're not seeing anybody who's filed on KREF. But word is that the sheriff out of Scott County is looking at running for that state Senate seat. I don't exactly know why. Maybe he wants to change up for the legislature. I know that if I was sheriff, sheriff's a full-time job. You don't have to travel to Frankfurt. And of course you're compensated as if it's a full-time job. While a lot of times, especially if you're doing it right, these state legislator seats, while they're supposed to be part-time jobs, can certainly turn into some full-time gigs. So it's kind of interesting that he made that decision. Elsewise, out of the Senate, we got John Schickel's 11th district. So far, Jesse Brewer and Steve Rawlings have filed for that. Remember, Steve Rawlings, current state House rep, making that move to the Senate. Word is Jesse Brewer, though, won't be running. And so right now, we just have Steve Rawlings set to file. And honestly, if I was up in that district, I would honestly just let Steve Rawlings have it. He's going to be a hard force to beat. He's very liberty, very conservative as far as that goes. They have a strong grassroots network there in that Boone County area that the district is basically 80% of. Steve Rawlings beating out an incumbent there 2 years ago for the state House seat, beating him pretty badly too. On top of that, you have the Marion Proctor, who's also in Boone County, beat out an incumbent, Sal Santoro, for her House seat 2 years ago. So you have a strong grassroots group there in that 80% of that district that has already proven they can overcome money and the establishment and have the networks to get it done to run that race. And so if I'm the establishment, if I'm anybody else, I just let Steve Rawlings have that. And then also, of course, you got Whitney Westerfield's open seat. So far, only one person has filed on KREF. You may see on the last day some flurry there. We'll go over that tactics here in a bit. But Christian County makes up a large part of that district. Very conservative county. I won that when I was running for state treasurer. They have a strong grassroots district. To see a strong conservative candidate coming out of there would certainly have a really good chance, no matter who the quote-unquote establishment uniparty decides they want to run for that seat. Whoever falls as that candidate, I think you should be able to see a pretty strong conservative candidate out of there. But of course, that goes into candidate recruitment. Always a very difficult thing to try to find somebody willing to run. It's a lot of work. It's money. It's time. You got to hit doors. You got to raise money. It can be very difficult for a lot of people. Well, coming up after this, we're going to look at those House races and then go into some of those stories there that I talked about at the top of the segment here. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Hopefully you'll stay tuned with me and learn something today. Listen up, my fellow business owners. You need to get your cybersecurity and IT support under control. Reach out to the folks at Amston today. Call 859-300-0087 or visit amston.com. It is no secret that cyber attacks have become a constant threat, and you need to make sure that your organization is protected. Amston has over 30 years of experience working with businesses and governments alike. Call 859-300-0087 or visit AmstonAMPSTUN.com today. And you are back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for that Kentucky politics news, commentary, analysis. I'm talking about open seats. We're coming up on that filing deadline in just a few days and looking at how the field is laid. We talked about that Senate. Let's talk about the House. We've got some interesting House races to look at too as well. A real interesting one here is House District 26, Russell Weber. And the reason why it's interesting is we may have some special election things go on in this race that's quite fascinating. So that's a Bullitt County area there. Russell Weber has had that seat for quite some time, I think about 10 or so years. And now he's stepping over to serve as deputy treasurer under Mark Metcalf. Now, there's a few reasons why legislators would do this. First off, pensions. It's a dirty little known secret that if you're nearing the end, you want to retire here soon from the legislature. Well, what you should go ahead and do is get a nice cushy, couple year, 4-year cabinet position job that pays high. Why? Because the way your pension works, instead of I'm not kidding. Instead of saying, okay, you worked, a state house rep works, quote unquote, part-time, makes about $40K a year. And so instead of saying, so you worked for 10 years making $40K, and then you worked for, in this case, it'd be 8 years if he's the deputy treasurer, and assuming Mark Metcalf runs and wins for re-election there for state treasurer, he would say, okay, I'm there for 8 years. That gives me 18 years. And, the deputy treasurer, it varies, but they make around 120, 130 grand a year or so. And so the way those pensions get tabulated, it's as if you made 120, 130 grand a year for all 18 years. That's a pretty hefty little pension bump there. That's one reason why people do it, to go ahead and up that pension dollars. But another reason why it could be that, once again, the job of legislator is a part-time, quote unquote, paid job, but can a lot of times be a full-time gig. It gets kind of interesting. So I was actually having this discussion with my wife about whether or not being a legislator is really part-time or full-time. It is a part-time job, but it's not part-time in the way that I think you would think of a part-time job. So if you went out and you got a 20-hour a week part-time job, what would you do? Well, you would work your 40 hours a week at your normal job, 9 to 5, and then from 5 to 9, 5 days a week, you work a second job, let's say. That's what you would think of as a part-time job. And so if you're working 20 hours a week, even 52 weeks a year, you would sit there and say, 40K or so ain't a bad pay. That's 80K a year if you're working full time. And so it's not that they don't average out to probably right around that 20 hours a week. The problem is it's not very conducive to having another job. Because, one, you have, several months out of the year where you are in the middle of the day. I mean, 9 to 5, 9 to 6, when the legislature operates, you're in Frankfort. And so if you live hours away from Frankfort, you're not able to work your other job while you're in Frankfort, surely. And then when you're out of session, there's, times, couple days a month where maybe you head to Frankfort for committee hearings or those kinds of things. But on top of that, you have to deal with constituent services. You take meetings. Those are during the day. So the issue is more so that you have to go to Frankfort. You have to miss work so many days. And then a lot of times the work is when you'd normally be working your other job. So it is truly a part-time job, but it's just not. In my opinion, I think it's truly a part-time job. You can be a very good legislator working 20 hours a week, but it's just not conducive scheduling wise to having another job. It makes it very difficult. And so switching over from that more part-time job to a full-time job, you're already spending the time in Frankfurt. The thought process by them is I might as well get a little extra pay for it. While at the same time, Weber could be setting himself up to run for state treasurer in 8 years or 4 years, depending on how many terms Mark Metcalf serves and decides to serve. So there may be, so he's stepping down to go work for Mark, and that starts in here. Probably started already. So he resigns that first day. Well, now that creates a vacant seat. That creates a special election situation. Possibly they could elect to do one of two things. So, famously for the legislature, when was it Alvarado? He stepped down. It was several years removed from having another election for that seat. So they went ahead and scheduled the special election to happen on the same day as the primary. And that's a pretty common thing when a legislator steps down at the beginning of a session. Then they scheduled the general election on the same day as the primary. So that way you don't have to conduct a whole special election, like with rolling out all that apparatus that goes into conducting an actual election. The problem here is that obviously, one, the district doesn't get representation then for that session, but they're not going to rush it. They're not going to have, obviously, the special election here early January. So that district won't get that representation. However, it gets real interesting because that seat's also up for its election this year. So if they decide to do a special election, you'll see almost simultaneously, you'll see the in-party primary process, which is where the parties that the district resides within has a process for selecting who represents them in those specials. So, the Bullitt County and Hardin County there would go ahead, come together. It's weighted based upon the population of the district and what counties they live in. And then the party comes together, they cast votes, and then whoever the actual party itself. So, it's like 50 people decide who is going to represent the Republican, who's going to represent, and then the Democrats do the same thing for the Democrat for the general special election. And then that takes place. And it'll most likely be scheduled, if it does happen, on the day of the primary. But the seat's also up for a primary at the same time. So the person running that gets chosen in the special also is simultaneously running for a primary seat at the same time for the same office. I don't even know. I honestly haven't looked into it enough to know if that's even legal for you to be running in two races simultaneously. That's kind of impossible to do. So they may not have a special. They may just leave it up for an open primary process, or they may have a special election and conduct it on the same day as the primary. So possible that the person who ends up running for that race wins two elections on the same day. So far, there's only one person who's filed for that seat there. That's Peyton Griffey. He seems to be kind of the party-ish choice there. I don't know if he's an establishment choice per se, but the party-ish choice. But also there's talk of Alan Markle, I believe is how you say his name. He kind of says it Miracle. You may remember him, ran for Secretary of State, tried to run for the state house priorly, got redistricted out, ended up running against Emily Callaway, I do believe in 2022, lost to Emily Callaway, but he used to be a state house rep in the 90s out of Bullitt County, supposedly the first Republican to ever win that seat. So he's talked about running for that. You also have Kevin Bratcher's out of House District 29. That's up in Louisville, but it's in that J-Town area, very more conservative area of Louisville. And Kevin Bratcher is looking at running for an open Louisville Metro Council seat. Why? Well, part of the reason why, as I go into, is you can either have a part-time job with part-time pay that's really a full-time job if you live an hour away from Frankfort, kind of like he does, and you have to go to Frankfort every day, or you can have a job that has almost the same amount of time, possibly. I don't know how much city council members of Louisville get paid, but I'm sure it's not a massive amount. I don't know if he's getting much of a pay raise, but it is much closer to home and probably has a little bit of a greater effect on the day-to-day of what's going on there. And so right now we have a Wyatt Allison who's filed to run in that Republican primary, as well as a Chris Lewis who's filed to run. You may see a few more people coming up before filing day. You also have Phil Pratt, also out of Scott County. Tony Hampton has filed to run for that seat. I'm sorry. I don't think Tony Hampton may be the sheriff of Scott County. Early on in my first segment, I was saying that the sheriff of Scott County is looking at running for senator, and he may be. actually running for Phil Pratt's seat. Yeah, he is the sheriff there. So Tony Hampton, got that wrong. Correct myself. Early on I said Tony Hampton was running, was talking him running for Damon Thayer's seat, but he's filed to fill Phil Pratt's seat. I apologize for that mistake. But anyway, so Tony Hampton, sheriff out of Scott County, looking to run for state house rep. My conversation about why he would do that still remains. Danny Bentley out of the 98th district, that's kind of northern eastern Kentucky. He's not running so far. Just an Aaron Thompson has filed. Also, you got a John Dixon out of the 11th. He's only been in for 2 terms. So far, JT Payne has been the only one to file. So after the filing deadline, I may cover some more interesting kind of incumbent races to watch, some challenges going on in the primary. But it will be interesting to see last minute filings. People file last minute for these kinds of seats all the time. It's to catch people off guard. They can't prep for it. These people who've filed early, you kind of leave them thinking, hey, I've got the momentum going. And then somebody comes in and cuts them off and gets the attention closer to it, can build momentum over a shorter amount of time. Also, as well, it becomes harder to plan against them. So, one thing the establishment will do is if you have a establishment person running that they want to win, then they'll have, if a more conservative Liberty Republican, whatever you want to call it, comes in and challenges that conservative person running. Well, what the establishment will do is they'll go out and get a patsy to run basically a half-hearted campaign, messaging on all the same things as the conservative liberty kind of person does. And their only job is to attack that person and then message the same way in order to take votes away from that liberty conservative person. In order to get the other person over the edge. A lot of times you'll see your more conservative people may wait to file to the last minute just because they don't want to prompt the quote unquote establishment being able to go out and find a candidate to run in a race to make it a 3-way or 4-way race. It gets interesting, these open seats. If it's a one-on-one race, and especially in a House seat, money doesn't always win. But if it starts being a 3 or 4 person race and you start cutting up those votes, money can really edge you out. And that's why you start to see some interesting things happen on that filing deadline. The news even will just stay up there and report on who's coming in. Well, after this break, we're going to be talking about this driver's licensing, switching over, something to watch on that. We'll have that coming up here. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. 859 Print has local service and low prices. I personally have done tons of business with them. And I can tell you, whether it is getting things printed off, sending direct mail, making business cards, buying TV ad time, digital marketing, they can do it all. And as a special for listeners of this show, they're offering 10% off any and all print services using code RIDER2024. That is code RIDER 2024 for 10% off. Check out 859 Print. You'll be glad you did. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Now, many of you may have noticed that your county clerks, your driver's licensing, not driver's licensing, but your registration services are going down for about 10 days. Now, why is this? Well, they say this has been in the works for quite some time, and it's in order to, quote unquote, modernize the system. And it's to make several updates, but one of those includes keeping your plates with the driver, not the car. So instead of, right now, if you put a plate on a vehicle, you sell that vehicle, the plates go with that vehicle, and then that vehicle's able to drive, operate. And until the person transfers the vehicle over to their name, that plate is actually still tied to the vehicle and tied to you as the owner. And then when they go in and change the registration, well, then what happens is the plate gets transferred as ownership to the new owner of your vehicle. That's what currently happens. But they're changing that to where you would, if you sell a vehicle, take the plate off the vehicle. And if the registration is still valid, you would then just put it on if you go out and buy a new vehicle, you just put it on that vehicle and you call them to change that registration over to that car. Now the person you sold the car to has no plate and they are forced to go down and transfer the vehicle. Now there's a few practical reasons to do this. One is that obviously people dragging their feet on transferring over vehicles. Over my time here, I've bought and sold a lot of cars, especially for my companies. And I mean, probably a good 10 or 15 cars over my company where I've had to buy vehicles and then I sell them off for my businesses that are used for that. And a lot of times, I mean, it's been a year or two later and the person's still driving around having not switched around the registration. And that gets interesting when you have parking tickets, fines, things like that. And you're like, they call you up for the money, or you have somebody driving across the bridge up in Louisville. They get the fee for crossing the river gets sent to you. And you're like, hey, I don't own this vehicle anymore. And you just send them a notarized statement saying, I don't own it. It's not mine. Well, now they don't know, of course, who to charge. So they're saying, hey, we want you to take the plate off. So they're forced to go get it. But there's another thing this is setting up for that has been conversation. And that by tying the plate to the owner, not to the vehicle, that makes this automated enforcement of things like fines and bridges easier. But you're also laying the base work to be able to argue better for what's called automated enforcement. And we're talking about red light traffic cameras. So right now in Kentucky, it is illegal for video enforcement of the law. So we have things called automatic license plate readers. And what they're doing is they're scanning for stolen vehicles, they're scanning for missing people or vehicles of interest, or stolen vehicles. But when it's found, it just alerts police to it. They still have to go and find the vehicle and arrest the person. But red light cameras aren't allowed in Kentucky, and there's been a lot of legislation to push it forward. Well, one of the conversations about why we shouldn't have red light cameras, now there's practical reasons why. For those of you who say, hey, look, I hate it when people run the red light, we should definitely have red light cameras. I understand where you're coming from, but the science behind red light cameras says they're actually more dangerous than helpful. People are more likely to break in situations where they normally wouldn't, creating dangerous situations. You're slamming on your brakes for yellow lights when you wouldn't before because you're afraid of getting that ticket, because you don't have, obviously, an officer sitting there has a little bit of discretion in saying like, hey, I understand the situation. It was raining out. That yellow light flipped. If they'd slammed on their brakes to make it for that red light, they would have skidded across. Maybe they're a few seconds too late on crossing that intersection, but, no harm, no foul. Nobody was going to hit them. Nobody else's lights had turned green. And, it was a dangerous situation for them to just suddenly break in. But with red light cameras, it doesn't have that kind of discretion that you ultimately need when you're enforcing the law, especially traffic laws. And so what ends up happening is people creates more accidents for red light cameras, also for speeding. You put out the speeding camera traps in order to catch people speeding as they're going down the highways and things like that. That can create some pretty dangerous situations. They have speed trap systems set up where they have a camera that reads your plate at the start, and then over the course of a mile, they then read your plate again. And if you average speed too high, they send you, of course, a ticket there for speeding. And that obviously can create some interesting and difficult situations where maybe somebody, to be safe, should really speed up and pass somebody. But they're afraid that if they speed up and pass, they got to slow back down. They're going to be hit for that charge. It has a lot of negatives to it, and it's really just a revenue generator for the state. That's what it is. But one of the claims against this kind of automated enforcement is, how do you know you're charging the right person? How do you know who's driving the vehicle? How do you know that vehicle is currently registered to them? That has been an argument against it. But with this change, well, now you're laying the groundwork for putting in place that kind of automated enforcement system, something that I think for a lot of people should give them pause. One, it kind of flies in the face of getting to stand against your accused. When your accused is a camera and not a person, it's kind of hard to face your quote unquote accusers, right? But the second thing is that once again, it does create, it's a revenue generator for the state. That's it. And it's really can subject normal everyday people to paying fines for doing what is reasonable things in reasonable situations. And you don't have the discretion of a person. That's why it's against the law now. Now, there has been laws in the past to change this. And obviously, this is setting it up for that to be a much easier thing. Makes me obviously uncomfortable. Of course, Bobby Holtzclaw out of Louisville, county clerk there. Funny enough, a Republican held on to that seat forever. Only Republican to win in Louisville. Also, interesting situation there that Republicans able to hold on to that seat for so long in Louisville. But she reportedly in the news, very excited about this. Makes some sense that she's got that bridge there and fines that go into it, and you can't renew or change registration until fines are paid off against somebody. And for crossing that bridge, and well, if they're saying, hey, I don't own that vehicle anymore, it makes it a more difficult situation for the county clerks, of course. But that is something that we should watch for. But the other thing they're going to be putting in place, as well as we have a new electric vehicle taxes, new fuel taxes, well, not fuel taxes, but electrical taxes that are going into place beyond some of the electrical taxes we've already put in. And that includes adding electric vehicles, $120 a year, a special tax on electric vehicles, and $60 a year for hybrid vehicles. I do have a question about hybrid vehicles. Sometimes, so for an example, like my truck is considered kind of a hybrid vehicle. It's an e-torque, it's Ram e-torque, so it's a VA Hemi, but then it's got a electric engine on it as well. That's a pseudo hybrid. It really only provides another mile or 2 miles per gallon here. But I'm still, and the reasoning behind this law here, we'll get to a second why this change here. But I'm only getting another gallon or 2 better fuel mileage than a normal Hemi. But what it provides is that immediate torque and acceleration that comes with an electric vehicle. That's really what it's there for. It's not actually there to provide you that much significantly of mileage. And why is that worth talking about? Well, the entire thought process behind adding on these electric vehicles and hybrids and extra tax is that they're not paying their quote unquote fair share of road maintenance. Right now, every time you fill at the pump, you pay 28 cents. That's what it is right now. It's based on wholesale price, but you pay 28 cents per gallon cost per gallon of gas you buy for your vehicle. But if you're an electric vehicle and you're out there, you know, if you've got a Toyota Camry that gets 35 miles per the gallon and you've got a Tesla Model 3, well, that Tesla Model 3 charges, you go buy gas. Under a few years ago, that Tesla Model 3 wasn't paying a dime for the roads, but at the same time was driving on it, while the gas vehicle was paying all the taxes for the roads. And the road fund, of course, is a tax that's generated out of the fuel. You have a federal road fund too. They also tax you. So when you're looking at the pump, you have 28 cents you're paying to the state, but you've got, you know, another, 15 cents that you're paying to the federal government, 18.4 cents. Sorry, had to double check that. But you've got another 18.4 cents. So every time you fill up at the pump and you're looking at that, you're paying somewhere around 40-ish cents, just 40, 42-ish cents just in taxes. And that's something the electric vehicles aren't paying. But we're going to be going over a little bit more in depth about those changes after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Remember, if you want to reach out to the show, just email info@theandrewshow.com.
Lexington Overstock Warehouse is Central Kentucky's best source for stylish new home furnishings. Don't pay retail. With our low overhead operating structure and big name brands, we offer the absolute best values on new furniture for every room. Shop online anytime at LexingtonOverstockWarehouse.com or visit our weekends only showroom located at 156 West Tiverton Way. Right now, for listeners of this show, we're offering a special discount for our online customers. Use coupon code FREEDOM for an additional 10% off your online order today. Lexington Overstock Warehouse, low overhead equals really low prices.
And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before the break, let's talk about this changeover the county clerks, and with that coming a new tax on electric and hybrid vehicles. Electric vehicles paying $120 a year, hybrid vehicles paying $60 a year, and for that to go into the road fund. But on top of that, now, so I was explaining, so the road fund here in the state and federally, all the dollars that go into our infrastructure, when people talk about it, we need to cut government spending and cut taxes and things like that. And they say, well, who will pay for the roads? Well, first off, it's the fuel tax that pays for the roads. It isn't the general fund. So cutting sales tax, income tax, those kinds of things doesn't affect road funding, doesn't affect traditional infrastructure funding. Now, it does, of course, stop boondoggle projects from happening, but That is the bulk of our road funding, comes from a gas tax. Now, federally, they don't have a way to currently capture a tax on electric vehicles, but at the state level, here in Kentucky, they have. And I would expect you would probably see at some point some sort of federal tax coming down on electric vehicles and hybrids, high mileage hybrids, in order to quote unquote pay their fair share, whatever that means. And what I mean by that is that, if you take a Toyota Camry, gets about 35 miles to the gallon, and then you take a Tesla Model 3 with standard mileage, the Camry, every time they fill up is paying, every time they go 250 miles is paying about $2 in tax to the state, about $1.50. So you're paying about $3.50, $3.75-ish in fuel tax to pay for the roads every time you drive 250 miles in a Toyota Camry. But a Tesla, especially one that's charging up at home, doesn't pay anything, but is still doing wear and tear on the roads. And so, government can't have that. Now, granted, I'm not saying I'm advocating for increased taxation at all. I don't think government should get another single red cent until they can tell me there's not a single dollar anywhere being wasted in our government anywhere. But of course, they can't say that. And they say, well, but this fund is for the road tax. This fund is for this. That fund's for this. I mean, this is different than your normal taxes. That's a real thing. Legislators have said to me when I've said this to them. I say, look, I understand that electric vehicles aren't paying their fair share. But honestly, I don't want to see increased taxation on anybody in any shape or form until the government learns to cut back, until they make the kinds of cuts they need to. And they say, but this is the road fund. This is an excise tax. Well, they forget that all these taxes come from the same taxpayer's pocket. And until they can sit there and prove we're not just wasting your money, and if they're wasting money over here, they can put that, if they save the money, they can put that into the roads without having to tax anybody more. But I also understand that electric vehicles aren't, quote unquote, paying their fair share. And in a way, the American taxpayer is once again subsidizing electric and hybrid vehicles by the way that our road fund is set up, because we're paying, us gas truck drivers or car drivers are paying a tax to build the roads. But these electric vehicles aren't, and hybrid vehicles, while doing the same wear and tear, are, doing twice as better mileage sometimes. And so therefore they're not paying the same amount of quote unquote tax as the rest of us in order to cover the roads. I understand that concept. And so if we suspend my just dislike for government making more money for a second, I do somewhat agree that if everything in a perfect world, that electric vehicles should also pay a special tax to cover the roads, because it's not fair that the taxpayer in just another way is subsidizing these electric vehicles. I mean, we already give them thousands of dollars of incentives. I mean, after incentives, it's in state like Colorado. I was reading an article about this the other day, about $20,000. If you add up all the tax incentives that go into buying an electric vehicle, like an F-150 Lightning, it's $20,000 in tax incentives. That is being subsidized by the American taxpayer. Now, this is another way, of course. And so they already had, though, before this, they had another tax in place where at 3 cents per kilowatt hour per electric vehicle charging up at one of these dealer stations. So, you'll see Ford or Tesla. If you go to like Buc-ee's in Richmond, you'll see a line of Tesla chargers. You go to, Myers in Hamburg. I know they've got a lot of chargers. Some Walmart's now got a lot of chargers. So those types of chargers where you go to plug in at, there's a 3 cent per kilowatt hour tax on that now that also goes to the road fund. And so your average Model 3 Tesla holds 50 kilowatt hours at 3 cents an hour. That ends up being $1.50 in taxes. Of course, the Tesla Model 3 claims to have a range of 272 on a full charge, probably closer to 250 miles. And so $1.50 for driving 150 miles. Now, a normal car gets about 35 mileage or so per gallon. A comparable car, like a Toyota Camry, pays a state tax. We're just looking at state taxes because the federal, that's a different situation. pays 28 cents per gallon. So on 250 miles, that ends up being about $2 in taxes. So a deficit of 50 cents compared to gas. Now the break even now, if you throw in this another $120 now the electric vehicles just have to pay, if every time they're filling up, the break even's 15,000 miles ish per year. So basically a Toyota Camry and a Tesla that every time is filling up at a dealer charger and is also registered in Kentucky would end up paying the same amount in taxes on 15,000 miles ish a year. But the thing is they don't. We know that electric vehicles are being plugged in at home. So I would expect here in the state, we're going to be seeing that amount increase. I think also you're probably going to be seeing that tax per kilowatt hour probably increase another cent or two in order to capture fuel, quote unquote, fuel tax from those that are passing through. It's very interesting. Electric vehicles provide a very hard taxing situation when it comes to if you're trying to do an excise tax to fund the roads, because you have a mix of things. So you've got people that don't live in the state that may not drive but 100, 200, 300 miles a year, where they actually have to pay for the electric versus they're like pay at a dealer spot. So they end up paying that 3 cents by kilowatt hour because they're just plugging in at home. And so all they'll pay all year might be $120, but yet they may drive still 10, 15,000 miles, and it doesn't nearly come close to what somebody driving a Toyota Camry would pay for the same thing. But at the same time, if we're saying, well, the kilowatt hour, right, we're breaking, we're 50 cents less on the gallon. Well, you're not capturing then the usage of a person passing through driving an electric vehicle, the same as a person passing through driving a quote unquote Toyota Camry. So I think you'll probably see that increase. But what's interesting about this change, it happened in 2022, House Bill 8 is where this change in taxing happened, is that they no longer have this fantastic false flag, as I call it, to get you to hate yourself enough to quote unquote modernize and be okay with legislators modernizing the gas tax. See, the problem is every time priorly that they've tried to do this, they've included this electric vehicle tax in with a gas tax to increase taxes on all of us. And they did that in order to sell the common person on, hey, electric vehicles need to pay their fair share. And then they bundle in there a tax increase on the common man that you or I, who don't drive electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles, would end up paying more in our fuel tax. And so my question is, how are they going to convince you to hate yourself enough to okay an increase in fuel tax now? It's an impossible task for them. I don't know how they're going to do it. Well, y'all, that's about what we have time for today. Now, tomorrow, I didn't get a chance to go into this. There's been a lot of things on a big headline on gambling this past week or two, where calls to the gambling helpline have increased threefold. I want to really dig into that, and I want to dig into some things about Bashir and his response to that and the way he's been handling that. Fortunately, we ran out of time today, so tune in tomorrow. Mark your calendars. Tune in tomorrow. We'll be digging into some of these gambling stories. I typically stray away from some of the gambling conversation only because it's there's many facets to the argument for and against gambling, and I like to represent them all equally. At the same time, not try to have too much my own opinion into it. That mainly because I just personally, I don't have my feelings on gambling are there, but they're just not super strong. Basically, I don't have. It hasn't impacted me personally. I don't gamble. My wife doesn't gamble. Nobody in my family gambles. And so while I have opinions on it, they're not specifically strong. So I don't often talk about it because, anytime you go into a realm where you start giving your opinion, you attract ire. And if you're not even that emotionally invested in your opinion in the first place, it seems like a waste of time. But there is an important story here that I want to dig into. I'll be covering that tomorrow. But you've been listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day.